Hello and welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's NCTR dialogue on the topic of decolonizing information. My name is Sandra Bender, and I am the Community Engagement and Education Program Coordinator with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. I'm here with three of my fantastic colleagues, including my own boss, Kaila Johnston, Director of Education, Outreach, and Public Programming, Madeleine Ricard, who is the coordinator of the Reconciliation Network Coordination Hub, and Preeti Kaur, Access and Reference Archivist. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that wherever we are watching from today, we are on ancestral territories. Some of those lands are now part of treaty relationships. Many others are unceded lands. Here in Winnipeg, where the four of us and the NCTR are located, we are on Treaty 1 territory, where our water is sourced from Treaty 3 territory and our hydroelectricity is sourced from Treaties 5 and 3 territories. We acknowledge the ancestors who cared for these lands since time immemorial and give thanks that we are able to live and work on these lands that continue to sustain all of us today. So now, today's dialogue is on the subject of decolonizing information. The month of September is an incredibly busy one for all of us, but it's also seemed like a good time to talk about our own work here at the NCTR and how we approach it. One could say that the primary role of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is to gather, hold, and care for information. We do that through gathering and storing documents, gathering statements from survivors, caring for the artifacts that we inherited through the TRC's archives, and expanding our base of information through research. Often when we think of places that hold and store information, we think of museums, particularly in their traditional forms, buildings with items on display that have some sort of historic significance with as much information as is known about the object, and very often coming from another culture without that culture's permission. When we think of research, we often think of visiting dusty libraries and books. When we think of gathering information, a Western view is often geared towards thinking of written documents again. So the three of you represent research, oral histories, and artifacts. I'd love for us to explore the work that you each do and what makes it different from the colonized versions that many of us are likely more familiar with. So Kaila, we know that you have to leave us early, so let's start with you. Could you tell us about your work as a statement gatherer back with the TRC and how that's continued into your role today?
Thank you, Sandra. When it comes to the work that we do here at the NCTR around statement gathering, it really starts with the work developed through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. I was one of the first 25 statement gatherers trained, and out of the 25 of us, only 2 of us actually made it through the full commission for a variety of reasons. One being its inconsistent work. Those who required, say, a steady paycheck, we weren't able to gather statements Monday to Friday, 8:30 to 4:30. It was really based upon community events, national gatherings, special requests. So with that, as I was a student, that worked out fairly well for me. And in addition to that, one of the biggest hurdles to overcome was related to vicarious trauma. So there were a great number of individuals, over 158 personnel in statement gathering, where with that, they realized they could do 1, 2, maybe a few statements, and that was as much as they were able to carry. And so those who were able to continue to do this kind of work, where they actually came from was through film, television, radio. Those who had expertise around using the technical equipment, our cameras, our audio recorders, who knew that fairly well. And it was much easier to get them set up and have an understanding about the stories and experiences, the truths they were going to hear, and prep them for that rather than the other way around and prep someone on how to use very technical equipment. These days, here at the NCTR, we don't have the same budget, we don't have the same team to be able to go out and do the same amount of work that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was doing. Over their 6 years, that was 5 years plus a 1-year extension, they were able to gather about 7,000 statements. It's really about 7,000 hours of audio visual footage. And with that, after the Kamloops announcement in 2021, we saw an influx or an increase of communities and individuals who were reminded about that, who were a little bit further along their healing journey and were ready to share again. And so we were doing it mostly on an ad hoc basis. However, with that increase, we saw and were able to secure a set amount of funding to be able to go out into communities again on a more regular basis to gather those truths. And as much as I would like to be able to do so, unfortunately, we still don't have enough of a team or budget to be able to meet the demand that exists out there. And part and parcel of this is actually communities doing their own work. So we do have a statement gathering unit today. It's a much smaller unit that goes out to a little bit of some different events and some ad hoc requests. But a lot of the work that I do right now is capacity building. So building upon the original guiding document developed for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then amended based upon our lessons learned, as well as the work done by a number of other organizations. We now have more of what I'll call a community-based guide, where we're able to share that with communities who are wanting to do this work so that they don't have to relearn the wheel or go through some of the same mistakes or challenges we do. So with that, they'd be able to, say, take training with myself or another team member to walk through this guide, get an understanding of the different components and aspects of statement gathering, and then come away with something that they can use to better support their own activities and engagements, or help inform any of their policies and procedures they want to update or develop. Now, I'll take pause and just see. Maybe I'll pause here. I do have more content about what's in the guide, but I'll let it rest for right now.
Kaila, could you tell us why it's important to have people speak about their experiences rather than just write them down or send us an email with their statement collected on a form or something? Why is it important to have that statement heard and gathered?
So when it comes to statement gathering, we actually accept all of them. So we will take written statements, we will take pre-recorded statements, we will take audio only, video, audio, we'll take artistic expressions, whatever means that someone wants to communicate their experience, we're going to accession. Now, the reason why the audio visual is so important, or why having this as part of our archival collection is important, is the majority of our records are from a colonial lens, either from the government or the churches, which is a very narrow scope and a very narrow perspective. And it only tells a part of the story. And we know generally abusers don't create records of abuse. So where we get the true experiences are from the survivors themselves. So having that opportunity where they can either disseminate information, share that experience to document the atrocities that occurred, or potentially as a means of healing or a cathartic means of kind of sharing that experience, having that opportunity to get it recorded and saved in an archive that's meant to protect this material in perpetuity is so important. And it also is a means of ensuring the survivor voice is the voice that is carried through, and it's not being interpreted, misused, or converted to tell another message. We get to hear directly from them in a method or a means that they get to control. And that's one of the heavy pieces of the work in statement gathering, is that it's survivor centered, and that we dictate all that we do in order for them to be in control of the process. For instance, regarding consent, whether they want to be anonymous or non-anonymous, or what they get to share, or where they get to share, or how that is the language they get to share in. So the idea being, we can collect this information for themselves, for their communities, for future generations, in a means that they get to control.
I love that you just mentioned language too. Do people share in their own languages? Do they have that opportunity?
They do get to share. During the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's days, whenever we did larger events, we would ensure that we had a number of language speakers within the region in order to facilitate that work, where the statement gatherer is able to understand them in that language. I will share there is a little bit of a challenge though. So for instance, we gathered a number of statements in Inuktitut and in Northern dialects. But when we talk about accessibility, right now, those statements are only in that language, which means it's really limited as to who can access them right now, except for those who can understand them directly. One of the challenges or hurdles that we're going to have to address sometime in the future is all of those statements given in an Indigenous language, get them transcribed, and B, get them translated so that that information isn't locked. We want to make sure it is accessible. And I know that's something when we're looking at the far line of all the wonderful things we'd like to achieve, that's one of them I'd like to add, is making sure that those survivors who spoke up in, say, Pond Inlet, that those in the South can hear and understand or get a concept of what that experience was like, both hearing it in Inuktitut or whichever dialect, but then seeing it in English and getting to understand that.
I think that's amazing. But I also think it's amazing that at least people had the opportunity to express themselves in their own languages and weren't forced into having to share through an imposed colonial language. So our ability and everyone else's ability to understand it is also super important. But yeah, at least people had that opportunity to share in the ways that felt right to them. You likely need to go. Do you have time for one more question?
I do actually. Things got pushed around a little bit, so I can stay longer as well.
Oh, nice. Okay. Well, then in that case, let's just go to Preeti. I'm going to put you on the spot. Can you tell us who you are and what you do? Yeah, we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Sandra. So I am Preeti Kaur, and I am the Access and Reference Archivist at the NCTR. So I do a variety of things, sometimes involving almost everything in and around the archives. But my main role is to acquire new records for the NCTR. And so if any documentation or records are coming in from varying organizations, institutions, private donors, that sort of thing, I am the one to take those in and to accession those records into our collection, into our archives. And that's a huge part of my role. But apart from that, I also take in artifacts, which is part of the acquisitions process. So just material that could be artwork, any type of artwork, of course, any sort of objects that have some sort of meaning to the donor or their family members. So that is another part of my role. And apart from that, I do research. So I do help survivors and their family members in obtaining records of their residential school experience. So a lot of that process involves going into our database, researching for that particular individual's records, and from there on, providing that back to the survivors and their family members.
That's fantastic. I've also, and I ask this because I've personally witnessed you taking care of some of the objects that we've been charged to care for. Back, I think it was in January, when Luke Marston, the master carver who created the Bentwood box, was here, and many of us for the first time were sort of in its presence directly without its protective what is it, plexiglass box?
Yeah, it's a case.
Yeah. And then you ended up giving it an oiling after that. But I've also seen you care for objects like the memorial cloth. Can you talk about what's, from a caring for objects perspective, what's different about the way you care for objects that have sacred value compared to objects that sort of just have historic value, like if you were in a similar role at a museum, say?
Right. Yes, actually, thank you for bringing that up. I think this is one of my favorite parts of the job, is to be able to handle such amazing pieces of art and sacred objects, etc. And so when Luke was here last year, I believe that was November, I felt very privileged to be able to oil the Bentwood box, which is probably one of our most sacred objects in the collection. It holds a lot of meaning to survivors and their families. And it is one that everyone and anyone can engage with. So Luke made that very clear, that it doesn't matter what your background is, what your gender is, and even if you've not attended school, you're not Indigenous, anybody can engage with it because it is a part of healing. It's a spiritual experience, which all human beings are capable of. And so I think that was a really great thing that he mentioned, and an important note to make. And so to answer your question, the difference in handling objects here at the NCTR, which are sacred, as opposed to ones that you would handle anywhere else at a different museum. The difference is, I believe, is the cultural ceremonial aspect to the objects. So I'll just provide examples. So for instance, if the bentwood box is going to an event, for instance, is going to be shipped to Ottawa soon, I think next week. And so before we pack it up, before we send it out, we will smudge the bentwood box. We will add medicines to the case that it goes in, and within the box itself, we have some medicines there as well, and it also travels within a red cloth. And so the ceremonial cultural elements to handling and caring for the objects is very different than if you were at a different museum, or at a museum of any kind, really. These ceremonies would not be taking place. Yes, they would be cared for and preserved for in that scientific conservation kind of point of view. From that perspective, they would be cared for, of course, but the ceremony would not be involved. And so that is a huge part of it. And yes, there are some elements too when we care for them. I'm still using the so-called like colonial aspects and colonial principles in order to make sure that our collection is well taken care of. But we ensure that those practices that are cultural and spiritual are incorporated into what we would normally do.
That's fantastic. Okay, I have more to ask you, but let's go to Madeleine. Madeleine, tell us about yourself and your work.
All right. So my name is Madeleine Ricard. I am the Knowledge Mobilization Coordinator for the Reconciliation Network Coordination Hub, which is quite a mouthful, not handful. So essentially, I am the coordinator for a national research program, which is in direct response to Call to Action 65, which is to develop a national research program in partnership with the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation to further understandings of reconciliation. So what that entails is I kind of coordinate 6 different research projects that are Indigenous-led and done by and for Indigenous communities that are centered around reconciliation and different themes of it, which I can kind of go into a bit later. In terms of myself, I am non-Indigenous. I have French settler heritage, and I'm from around rural Manitoba. And I'll talk about later a little bit how positionality is important and acknowledging that. In terms of what I do on a day-to-day, I create different opportunities for the research projects involved in the Reconciliation Network to collaborate and do additional knowledge sharing that is accessible and different things like that. So that's essentially what I do, who I am. I'm very grateful to be working here at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation and to do my part as an ally in this work.
Well, that actually, that's the perfect segue into the next thing I was going to ask all 3 of you now to touch on. This is something that I find very personally relevant too, as most of my role has to do with public education. In fact, the vast majority of it. I literally just joined this from yet another Crown Corporation public presentation. But engaging with these stories, this history, these documents, these artifacts, as a non-Indigenous person is means for me personally needing to take a particular care with how I engage in that. Madeleine, you just talked about that. Would you like to say more about how you approach that as an ally?
Yeah, for sure. So being a non-Indigenous ally impacts my approach to how I do my work. My position on it is that as an ally, I would like to do my part in reconciliation. It involves everybody, obviously. So as an ally, I really focus on amplifying what is being said by the community, by elders, survivors, rather than my own kind of take on things. So obviously I add value where I can, but I really focus on amplifying what is being said and making sure that I can make whatever I can make happen, I make happen. And part of this is really being open-minded and adaptable. Sometimes you have biases that come up that you don't know, and someone will give you some feedback that maybe you don't expect. And being really open and taking time to reflect on feedback and making sure that you are asking for feedback and collaboration and things like that is really important, to make sure that you are checking in and making sure that your biases that everyone comes to the table with are being kind of addressed, and you're constantly making sure that you're doing the work in a good way. Obviously, we're all human. We all come to the table with biases and knowledge gaps and our own lived experiences. So incorporating the lived experience, feedback of others, their stories, everything like that into your work is very important for me as an ally. I'm constantly being guided by Indigenous ways of knowing and being. If there's a teaching that I can receive and put into my work, I definitely seek it out and take opportunities where I can. But I also make sure that I don't take up spaces where I'm not meant to be. So these are some of the ways that I approach my work. I make sure that I'm reflecting on my positionality, checking in continuously, and also not being afraid to broach difficult topics and in respectful ways. So sometimes things are uncomfortable and we avoid them, but it's really important to come to the table and just be curious and open and say, how can I do this differently? And also what is difficult about this, and address that directly. It really helps everyone at the table feel more comfortable, and also just benefit in general from the conversation. So that's kind of my approach.
Your approach sounds very similar to mine. Well, Preeti, you talked about the importance of, or the ceremonial aspects of how you handle these objects. Do you want to talk about that as far as being Indigenous or not Indigenous and how you engage in that respect?
Sure. Yeah, I think I'll have some overlapping points as well from what Madeleine just said. But yes, being non-Indigenous, it definitely changes the way that I internalize the process and the way I go about it. One thing I wanted to mention was that we do ask the elders on their just basically on their opinions and their knowledge and their teachings as to how we should handle objects that are already at the archives here or are incoming to the archives as well. So as somebody who is still learning, I would like to make sure that we are doing it the right way. We're doing it in a good way that the elders would appreciate. For example, we had a large art collection come in not too long ago, but maybe a couple of months ago now. And so when we did acquire the collection from the artist himself, we made sure to have elders involved, so they came to the center when the artwork came to the center as well. And they provided guidance, they provided a prayer, and just having them in our presence and in the presence of the artwork and of the artist, I think makes a huge difference, because they are able to see the work that we are doing, and we can also consult with them as to how we should go about the process. And so it's just a wholesome way to have everybody involved as much as possible. So that's something I'd like to make sure is happening, that I'm doing something in the right way as much as possible. But as somebody who is non-Indigenous, I think the learning continues for years on end. So my thesis for my master's that I did here at the University of Manitoba within the Archival Studies program, that was on the topic of colonization and Indigenous lands, and it was based on microfilm records, but the context was about the topics that we work with every single day here at the NCTR. And so from then on, I've been able to learn more and more and more over the years. So I think that's obviously going to be a continuous process. But moreover, I am somebody who was born in India, so I was not born in Canada. And from my background, I can speak to this a little bit as well. I see a lot of similarities that come from my culture into the cultures that First Nations cultures and onwards. But I think that provides a little bit of comfort to me, knowing that there are similarities, and that maybe I can bring that to the table as well. For example, my grandfather was a freedom fighter in India as well, when India was being colonized by the British. And so I feel like I have that piece that I can sympathize with. And I tend to think about that quite a bit when I do my work, because, you know, we were also fighting for our culture and our land, and doing the things that the Indigenous peoples have experienced in Canada. And yesterday, actually, there was a moment that was really great at the youth event. So Premier Wabkanu was on stage giving his amazing inspirational speech to all the students. And at one point he was telling us about how he was braiding his son's hair in the morning, that morning. And, you know, he was saying, wear your hair long, show your culture, and be proud of it. And so my background actually is Sikh, and so I'm of the Sikh religion, and for us, long hair represents something very similar, and it is part of our identity. It is something that, you know, shows us that this is who we are Sikh. And so when Wab said, you know, Premier Wab said, keep your hair long, and that is something we teach our children, keep your hair long. And he made a joke that even those who have short hair, he still loves them. It's great, you know. I have chosen to cut my hair, but like, for instance, my father, he keeps his hair long and wears a turban. So there's a lot of similarities. We just show them in different ways. So I can bring that knowledge that we hold dear to our culture and ourselves, and bring that to the table when we do our work, and we have the same type of respect for our elders, the way we take care of them, the way that we learn from them and listen to them when they have something to say, any sort of wisdom they have to offer. We take that into account in the same way that we do with our elders here at the NCTR. So I feel like I've been able to kind of smoothly make that transition into our organization, into our archives. And so I find that comforting, but you know, it's a nice feeling.
That's a really beautiful answer. And I think that parallel between your own culture and the history of India and the brutal colonization of the British there, I can see the direct parallels or the relevance to you personally. My family is half Irish, and they would absolutely talk about the impact of Britain there too. That said, given that Kaila, you yourself are of Cree ancestry, can you talk about how this is for you as someone whose cultural stories and histories these are to be engaging in this kind of work, whether it's now as the director of education or back when you first started as a statement gatherer. How does that feel as someone who's inside this community and this history?
Well, first to tell a very quick story. So my knowledge and understanding of the impacts of residential school system on my family growing up was very much limited. They were very, very good at colonizing my mother, who married a non-Indigenous person. So I'm of mixed heritage, but Cree being one of the strongest communities I'm connected to. But I'll tell you, I didn't really learn that necessarily until my mother was completing her Indian residential schools form for the common experience payment. And I looked and I saw she wrote down Cree. They lived in Blackfoot territory, and I had made the assumption for most of my childhood that we were Blackfoot because they had lived in Alberta in this territory. So it was quite an identity shock to see that come up and realize I was Cree the whole time, and I had kind of brushed things off going, oh, I don't need to learn Cree or Anishinaabe because I'm Blackfoot. I would want to try and learn Blackfoot. Lo and behold, I learned this, and it was an identity shift. And so it's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about genealogy. For all the folks, my colleagues here who know about my love of genealogy, why I'm so passionate about that is because it has given me back a little bit of that identity to figure out who I am, where do I come from all the different places that my family is from, and really have a sense of who am I part of, what community am I part of, who can claim me. And there are a variety of communities that can do that. So throughout this, it's actually been a very long learning journey that I'm still on today. And I will say I'm still making mistakes that I learned from when it comes to ensuring that I'm engaging in proper protocol when it comes to the requests of elders or survivors, or ensuring that I'm doing so in a way that doesn't cause more harm than good. And I'd say that's one of the tenets I always keep firmly in my mind, is that whatever work I do, I cannot cause more harm by doing it than by not doing that. But if I do make a mistake, it's one of those, I apologize for this error. This is something I'm going to carry with me forward from there. But it is something that we try to keep in mind for statement gathering. So specifically, once upon a time, all we offered was tobacco, but recognizing Inuit and Métis communities often don't take tobacco, they might take tea instead, having a little bit more flexibility as to the offerings or gift we're able to provide these individuals who are coming to us and wishing to have that knowledge and share exchange. But also, for instance, our Kleenex, or I should say our tissues and the paper bags. So for any of those events that we're still collecting those tissues to go on the paper bags, to go into the sacred fire, so that we are acknowledging and recognizing those harms, that they're not getting tossed away, but they are being placed in that ceremonial atmosphere. And then going and looking at the September 18th event, for those who are just tuning in, you can check out the YouTube channel to watch yesterday's event to see what I'm referencing here. But it was a live youth empowerment event with 6,000 students. Prior to the event, although you do not see it in the actual performances, it's 8 a.m. yesterday, we started with a pipe and water ceremony and the lighting of the kudlik for the Inuit communities. And that was really part and parcel in ensuring that there's ceremony or components that are connected to our work, to ensure that we are doing it in that good way, which was the tentative theme of yesterday's session, is the good life, Mino Pamata Sawin, and everything that encompasses that good life.
It was such an incredible event. Yeah, and you've raised such a good point too about, even if you're within the broader Indigenous community, it doesn't mean, there are so many different nations and different protocols within those that we don't just know. There's no one way of engaging in ceremony. But yeah, I imagine that process, I know that you were one of hundreds, very few among those hundreds of statement gatherers who made it all the way through that process, because hearing those stories is so heavy. And I can only imagine as an outsider to these stories that it would be harder to hear. This is my own speculation, but were they harder to hear, knowing that these were stories of your own, as it were?
That's such an interesting question, simply for the fact that my combination, I suppose, of personality and other qualities, the path that I've taken, I have lived a very privileged life. Although I'm Indigenous, I've benefited from a number of things thanks to my mixed heritage. But I will say I'm fairly well set up for hearing these stories. And I'll say that I think it's because some of the teachings that were passed on to me, the biggest one I have for anyone who wants to get engaged in statement gathering work is that is not your truth or story to carry. You are operating as a mechanism. And I know it kind of sounds like we're dissociating or putting ourselves at a distance, but we really have to think of ourselves as statement gatherers, as tools for the statement provider. We're there to transform or transmit that story and experience, that truth for them. So I can't have the luxury, or I cannot take that statement with me. That's not my story bundle. That's not for me to carry. I take comfort in knowing, although there are many horrible, tremendous things that have occurred, and I will say it's also been influenced with my work in international crimes and criminology and some of the things I've seen at the international level, that there are horrendous things that have happened. And I am empathetic and I have feelings for those that this has happened to. But I have to make sure I'm in good health and I'm in a good place to be able to carry those stories and pass along to those who need to hear them. And so I can acknowledge the feelings and the experiences that I have in hearing, listening, or experiencing it, but then I have to let it go. I have to let it go and let it be carried through. Now, I do see a question in the chat. Yeah. I'm going to save that if that's okay. I know we're going to do rounds, unless Sandra, you think I should answer it.
There are two very good questions that have come in. Jennifer's was first, but since Angelia, I'm saying Angelia. I hope I'm saying your name sort of close to right. Just because yours is so related to what Kaila was just talking about, I'm going to put that first, and then Jennifer, I promise we'll come to yours. So here's the first question. I'll just read it out loud for accessibility. Kaila, you mentioned tobacco for Anishinaabe and tea, but who is the tea for, and what was the other offering? Sorry, I missed that as I was writing.
So originally with the TRC, we did tobacco ties and then actually grandfather rocks. We haven't carried on with grandfather rocks here at the NCTR, but the tea was just another means that anyone could accept, knowing the Inuit, they like a lot of northern teas. The Métis also, tea is something that we see. And we have red rose here. You'll find that in almost every single drawer. But there's a selection of items. Sometimes depending on the request, we're able to bring broadcloth or other items that would be the best way we describe it is, a gift or an offering. And the piece with that, it's really for that exchange of this is the truth or their experience they're sharing with us, and this is what we can give to them for that expression. And oftentimes those who did take the tobacco, it was actually taken to the sacred fire and placed in the sacred fire, or they would hold it during that statement to carry all of that, to think about what were they sharing and then taking it out there. And so it's evolved and changed. And I will say, when it comes to our guide, you will see our guide is slightly different from, say, 2024 January to now September 2024, because of the evolving nature of this work. We're always learning new things and changing things, adapting them to make it a little bit more accessible to community. And I always say, it is not a hard-lined rule to follow all of the rules or procedures or policies that we've developed in the guide. It's to inform your own procedures. If there's something that you see in there that is just not going to work, don't utilize it. Find the stuff that is going to work for your situation, for your own activities, and utilize that. For instance, you may not be able to gather those tissues for whatever reason, health-wise, or you may not have a sacred fire. And you just have to work within the limitations or within that scope that you're able to do this work. But you can at least see how we have emerged or how we have developed things and go from there.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. All right, now Jennifer, I promised some time ago in the comments to share your question. So here it is. The question is, a big topic in libraries and probably archives too is the language we use to describe items in our collection. What system does the NCTR use to describe its items for external users? So Preeti, I'm thinking that's for you.
Yes. So the system that we use, essentially, as an archive and as many other archives would like to do, is to keep things in some ways as organic as possible. So the way that material comes in to the archive, we make sure that it represents what the donation, where the donation has come from, so the provenance of that donation, whether it be textual, photographic, audiovisual, records or material objects. And so we ask the donors to supply us with metadata or data that is related to the donation itself. And so either that can come in file lists, that can come in through just written paragraphs within our donation agreement. And it really just depends on what the donor has at their disposal in order to describe what they are providing to the NCTR. And so it can vary from archive to archive. It can vary from private donors. So the bigger sort of overarching answer to that is it really just depends on who we're getting this material from. So there's no set system that we are using, but for example, when I'm accessioning material, it is accessioned according to the information that's been provided by the donor within the file list, within the metadata. And usually they'll let us know that, you know, I received this painting or I received this photo from my father, who received it from his father. And so from there, we can determine the provenance of that photograph and the scope of it. And so we know, at this point, we now know who was the owner of this photograph. And so all of that information goes within the description of the material, of the donation that's been provided to the NCTR. And it also goes into the accession as well. And so language, again, as we kind of spoke about a little bit earlier today, of course, it can be difficult because not all of these materials that are coming to the NCTR are in traditional languages. They are in English and sometimes in French too. And so I think that part is a little bit, you know, unfortunate, because of course we are trying to build an Indigenous based archival collection, and so we want to be able to represent the languages that are that the subjects would have spoken, that the individuals would have spoken. And so what we're trying to do at the archive here is to very much decolonize in as much, and in a good way, but as much as we can. We are located on a Western institution and the land of a Western institution, so at the U of M. So we're not fully Indigenous in that way. And so we do abide by rules and laws that are governed by sometimes the U of M, a lot of the time by the government of Manitoba, of Canada, right? And so we do take those things into account, but some ways that we are describing items is essentially to also not use bad language. And so language that is not inappropriate anymore. And so those kinds of terms are eliminated. And if they ever do pop up, a lot of the time they don't anymore. But if they do, we make sure that I'm not using those same words to describe an item within our database. And so in our database, you won't find that, which is our way of lessening the harm and doing things properly. And that is more meaningful to the individuals and communities that are accessing our records. But just to speak a little bit more on decolonizing our archives, I work with Raymond Frogner, who is head of archives and really well known within the archival community. And so he has provided some points as to how we're decolonizing the archives. And so one of the points that he brings up is that we acknowledge the overlapping multiplicity of the rights and provenance and meanings within an archival document. And so language is part of that. And we have to acknowledge what languages the records come in, and if they're not in traditional languages, we're still acknowledging the fact that yes, this is in English, this is in French, but this is still somebody who was Indigenous that is being spoken about in these records. And so that's part of just acknowledging and making sure that we're using this knowledge that we've encompassed and learned about over the years, that we must know that we have to, as we do the work, we must know that we can't forget who the subjects are, and these are survivors, they're intergenerational survivors as well. And that's part of the work that we have to do. And as archivists, we do acknowledge and we have to remember why we're doing that work. And I think that really plays an important role in how we go about our everyday processes as well. And another point that Raymond has made is really great is that we provide a social memory infrastructure. And so these are the memories of the survivors and the children that didn't make it home, and everybody that was involved within the residential school experience. And so the fact that this institution is a institution of memory in a Western sense, but we can do all that we can in order to preserve the moments and preserve those memories that are of the subjects at hand. And so we are trying to be as survivor-centric as possible. Our arrangement in our database is not necessarily survivor-centric yet, but we are looking to make sure that we start doing that a little bit more. And so, well, that could be participation of the survivors, the elders, and even when we do keyword searches within ADAM, our database, we can do it through individuals. We can do it by plugging in a name rather than the institution who created the records as well. And even in sometimes our meetings, we have discussions about what kind of terminology we should be using. So within archives, we use the font system in order to arrange the material within a collection within an archive. And so something that Raymond actually brought up, which was really great, is that we want to move away from the word font and use something that's a little bit more culturally neutral. And so for now, he was saying, maybe we can use aggregations and something to just show that this is, a category, but just to move away from that. So this is part of that language, that terminology that we try to keep in mind as we do the work.
Well, that I think ties very nicely into Madeleine, your work, essentially managing a whole research hub of Indigenous-led research practices, right? Would you like to speak a little bit more to that whole network and how that works?
Sure. And I just wanted to kind of add on some of Preeti's points of, in terms of reconciliation, it is reconciling that we are in colonials. Part of it is reconciling that we are in colonial spaces, trying to reclaim or decolonize practices, right? So we're still in these spaces, we're still having to use some of these practices, but while incorporating and trying to reclaim some of the good practices that Indigenous cultures have had that were erased and taken away. So I just wanted to kind of add to that. It's ongoing. So in terms of the project, the Reconciliation Network, it's a very important project, and it was one of the calls to action given by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So this project is really to seek how to have increased understandings of reconciliation. There's a lot of misinformation out in the public sphere, in the academic sphere, and there's lack of information as well. So it contributes to a lot of misunderstandings and assumptions that are made, and that leads to frustrations and different things like that. So this project, a big part of it is making the knowledge that is being gathered accessible to the public, to Indigenous communities, and change makers also. So a big part of this is making the knowledge and information accessible in different formats that are outside of the traditional colonial kind of uses. So rather than a researcher going into a community, imposing their research question, gathering information and knowledge from the community, taking it away and then squirreling it away in academic papers that are behind paywalls that most people don't even know exist and things like that, has been some of the harmful ways that research and colonial research has happened in the past. So this project really looks to get things out in the open, but also to make sure that Indigenous communities are owning the knowledge that they are contributing and that they should be benefiting from. So in the past, a researcher could have gone into the community and said, I'm doing this great research project on a health issue or something like that the community faces. Can I collect information? The community would give information, and that information would be taken away. The community would never be given the information as to how to fix the issue or address the issue, and things like that. That's been a big way that colonial research has really harmed communities and also just taken away agency over knowledge. Knowledge is sacred, and a lot of it has just been stolen. So this project, the Indigenous researchers are closely involved with investigators, which are the communities themselves and community organizations, and they get to decide in their relationship with the Indigenous researcher what is being looked into, what the research is, but also how their information and knowledge is being stored, who gets to access it on a broader level to analyze it, and things like that. But also there's a lot of collaboration involved, which is a more Indigenous practice of having each of the projects collaborate with each other, even though they're on different themes. So some are on cultural revitalization, language learning and revitalization for Indigenous languages, and then some are on forest fire and wildfire recovery systems. And these seem like they're very different things, but they're interrelated in a lot of ways. A lot of the vegetation or the plants burned up by wildfires have cultural significance for ceremony and things like that. And ignoring that in the recovery processes is detrimental to some communities and their ability to have the sacred, like picking their medicines, but also just having the agency and control over their lands. So there's a lot of interrelated things that happen, and it's important that this project, each of the research projects, collaborates with each other, and they are in various parts of Turtle Island or Canada. So from coast to coast to coast, we have representation. And also, another really big part of the network is relationship building, which is ceremonial in some aspects. And it's really taking time to make sure that the relationships are made in a good way with the communities, with the researchers, and everyone involved. And these relationships aren't just one-sided. The information is being taken and used. It's that we are taking the information you want us to take from the community, and we are doing something with it. There's a term like being thrown around recently of reconciliation. So this research network and research program really looks to make changes, whether it's to policy, whether it's to the stories being told in places. There is a project dealing with what story is being told about the city or where the place is, things like that. So reclaiming a lot of aspects. This is a very strengths-based network where we are looking at all the ways that Indigenous cultures and people have been resilient, have retained their culture, and are now going to be making the changes to make sure that reconciliation is possible. A lot of these frameworks have to be rebuilt and set up. So that is a big part of what the Reconciliation Network is looking to do, but also to make sure that Indigenous allies like myself and others, the public at large, have a way to know what they can do for their part in reconciliation. Because there's a lot of different things that we can do in our everyday lives. So that's kind of the gist of it. Thank you, Sandra.
Yeah, thank you. We're pretty much at the end of our time. I just wanted to acknowledge there was one question from a Greg who wanted to ask Kaila more about genealogy as a decolonial or anti-colonial practice.
I can do it in 30 seconds.
Okay, then 30 seconds it is. I was going to suggest you guys email, but go for it, Kaila.
Perfect. For those, here's up on screen. When it comes to my work with genealogy, it's actually all self-taught. I started when I was 15 as a teenager trying to figure out who am I. I knew a lot about my Ukrainian English roots, really nothing about my Indigenous roots. So that's what got me started. And it's been a work in progress for these, actually now coming on 20 years now that I think about it. I will say what a lot of people miss is a lot of these records they don't realize are digitized. For instance, the treaty annuity records a couple of years ago that I found, really great big help when it comes to identifying that. I have some cousins I've learned around the way. One is Dean Lara out of Saskatchewan. He's been using genealogy to connect those impacted by the 60s scoop to try and identify who is their home, who are their family, who's their home community. I met an Asagan also from my home community who's doing very kind of similar work in using genealogy, using digitized records to fill in the gaps that colonization has created. And so in general, I found them very useful tools, not all encompassing. For instance, the treaty annuity records don't record women's names up until the records that are available, which is the signing of the treaties to, I believe, 1909, 1913. It's just male relatives. So that is a huge limitation. But there are ways to use these records to fill in the gaps. And I found for me, that's one of the ways that's been very useful. So if you would like to talk more about genealogy, Sandra was going to put my email into the chat, but I can also do so. Feel free to reach out at any time. I'd love talking about this and how we can use this to help others.
There you go. It's coming. I was just going to say it out loud, but these comments won't stay live on the video in its video form after the fact. So feel free to email Kaila. She can talk about genealogy for a long time. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to my three amazing colleagues for the work that you have done and will continue to do, hopefully for a long time. And thanks for taking your time to be here with us today to share about this important subject. Hey, have a great day. We'll see you next week on our Lunch and Learns.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.